Welcome to the Appraisal Buzzcast, where today we take a long, squinty-eyed look at the state of the appraisal profession. The people who measure the American dream with a laser and clipboard and still somehow get blamed when the deal falls through. Now, you may have heard the rumors the appraiser is going the way of the town blacksmith. Quaint and dispensable, increasingly hard to find. We're aging, they say, like a fine bourbon, or maybe a rotary phone. But before we light the lantern and start telling ghost stories about the looming shortage, we've invited someone who actually knows what the data says. Today, we separate myth from math and imagine what's next for the profession, whether we're riding into the sunset or just getting warmed up. So buckle in. This isn't a funeral, it's a frontier. Stick around till after the break and we'll dive into the numbers like the proper data nerds we are. And now a word from one of our sponsors.
Intercorp, a division of Norman Spencer, has your back. Comprehensive insurance coverage from a team that's always there when you need them. The team at Norman Spencer is ready to roll up our sleeves and dig into your toughest insurance questions. We're committed to appraisers and AMCs. Intercorp's programs are tailored specifically for the appraisal industry. Put our experience to work for you. Please contact Susan Lomeli, Lomeli, at norman-spencer.com to discuss your insurance needs. You're listening to the Appraisal Buzzcast with your host, Hal Humphreys.
Welcome back, everyone, to today's Appraisal Buzzcast. We have a really interesting episode today. Let me bring in Hal Humphreys, and we're going to talk about it. Hey, Hal.
Hello, Jim. How are you today?
I'm doing good. Well, our guest today took it upon himself to delve into the appraisal subcommittee and found some pretty interesting results. Our guest today is Chase Persley. Let me bring him in. Hey, Chase.
Hey, guys. Good to be with you. Good to be back.
He's the founder
Chase, thank you for taking the time to be here. Go ahead, Jim. Sorry about that. I stepped on Jim Morrison, a thing that I tend to do when I'm on air in front of the mic. Sorry about that, Jim.
Our guest today is Chase Persley. He's the founder of two appraisal-centric companies, Appraisal Inbox and JobsAndAppraisal.com. Chase, thanks so much for joining us.
Yeah, glad to be here. Always fun to talk about data. I know for some people that might glaze their eyes over and bore them, but I think for a lot of people in the appraisal industry, we live and breathe data. So I think this will be a fun episode.
Yeah, I'm excited about it. The thing is, we as appraisers deal in data all the time. And if you've ever heard Lyle Radke from Fannie Mae speak, he said, we're looking for data-driven results. We're looking for data-driven analysis. We're looking for data-driven. We're all about the data. And I'm really excited about the conversation today because, you know, you've done some research into the appraisal subcommittee. And before we get started on that business and what you found in your deep dive into the data available, tell our listeners a little bit about your history in the industry. Just paint us a quick thumbnail version of how Chase Persley got into the appraisal profession.
Sure. So going back, I'll keep this pretty short, but going back, I studied real estate in school, so I have the degree in real estate and all that, and wanted to go into the analysis or appraisal direction. And so I got hooked up with a commercial real estate appraiser who focused on senior housing. So went into that right after college and had a fun time with it. Also had some background programming and with technology, and we ended up kind of having an issue with our order management. We had just a super Excel job log. So I built a piece of software that eventually over time became Appraisal Inbox. And so I have, that kind of a bit of a tech background too, strong database skills. I always like dumping spreadsheets into the database and running SQL queries on it and that sort of stuff. So that's kind of the quick version. And recently, my main thing is Appraisal Inbox. It's an order management platform to help real estate appraisers manage their business and their calendaring and their order workflow and all that. Something that I've always wanted to do and something that I've always been interested in. I've always been interested in helping free up appraisers' time, help them streamline the really tedious, boring stuff, the office work that nobody really likes doing, let them focus on where they add the value the most, pun intended, and that is, the opinion of value, not pushing papers and filling out fields and forms and stuff. And so I've always been interested in helping appraisers streamline things on that side. But just in general, like on the business side, making more money, finding private clients is kind of been a big topic the last, 5 years, maybe even more at this point. And so there's a project that I've been wanting to put together for a long time, and I hadn't got around to it until kind of the end of last year. And that is a job board. So a job board and a newsletter just for the appraisal industry. Because if you go, like, if you're someone, well, I guess let's stop there before going there. So most appraisers are, we assumed, residential appraisers. That makes sense. There's more residential properties. And then the bulk of them are lone wolves working on their own, or maybe they have an assistant or something, but they're usually work on their own or a small team. But they take private clients, they take AMC, some might take AMC, lender work and that sort of thing. Most of them don't work for the big shops, but there are people who do work as licensed appraisers for big shops. And there's also a whole other side of the industry, which I kind of ignored for years, and that's government appraisal work. Your local jurisdiction, they have licensed appraisers working for them, or other types of people who help out with the mass appraisal and that kind of stuff. And so what I realized is there are actually jobs out there for appraisers. There are other avenues to working in the industry other than to working for yourself. And so, maybe it's boring to some people, and maybe some people really like the idea of that steady paycheck every 2 weeks. And if you go work for your local county, maybe you won't make as much as a fee appraiser. I guess it really depends, what your local situation is. But if you want you want a stable job, want to be able to stay in the valuation professional, there are jobs in government. I mean, there's jobs at local level, there's jobs in the federal government, all kinds of interesting stuff like that. I started digging into it. So I put together a job site called Jobs in Appraisal. That's jobsinappraisal.com. And it's a job board for real estate openings, real estate appraisal and valuation openings. And in the past, if you're looking for that type of job, you might go to the Indeed.com or something like that. And those aren't really hyper focused, and it's really hard to dig through that and find a relevant opening that's in your location. And so that was kind of the idea behind that, was to put together a job board for the valuation industry to help people find jobs if they're interested in working for somebody else.
I love it. There's just a quick story about working for a local municipality. I had a friend of mine was an appraiser. He still is an appraiser, private practice, working by himself, has done for 40 plus years now. He got a call from the local tax assessor's office where he lives, and a mutual friend invited him to come work at the tax assessor's office, and he did the process, got on board, and lasted an entire 3 days at the tax assessor's office because he was not comfortable with the lack of flexibility that he was used to,
Right.
Before he was able to come and go as he pleased. But he did make note that, it is super interesting to have the idea of a regular paycheck, a retirement setup, benefits, those kind of things.
Retirement.
Yeah. I mean, I'm never going to retire, Chase. So, you recently published an article, and for those watching on YouTube, we'll include a link in the description to read the article. It's jobsinappraisal.com, resources, ASC data analysis 2025. I know that's a long URL and you're not going to remember it if you're listening, but go to the YouTube channel, check it out. We'll have a link there. You did a deep dive into some of the data the ASC has on appraisers, and I'm just going to throw a number of questions at you and you answer them as you see fit. Number one, why did you decide to start this project? Number two, what were some of the interesting things you found? And then I guess the most interesting thing from my perspective is, what was the hardest part of sorting through this data? As appraisers, we often have to sort through a bunch of information. What was the hardest part? So first question, why did you do this? Second question, what did you find interesting? Third question, what was the hardest part?
Yeah, so one of the things, I'm sure everybody kind of has a general idea of how many appraisers they think are in the U.S. or in their state. I've heard numbers all over the place, and I got to the point where I really just want to know how many appraisers are in the U.S. And so, the natural place to go was to the appraisal subcommittee site. They have a place where you can download all the licensed appraisers. You can filter by a few fields. So I pulled that data down, and I looked at it, and it was in spreadsheet format. And I think there was about, let me see, around 91,000 active appraiser license. And at first, you might think, okay, well, there's 91,000 appraisers in the US. Then you realize, well, there's many appraisers who have licenses in multiple states. You have specialty appraisers. You have appraisers who work for the big companies that have to have licenses. You have people who, border states, like in Georgia, where I don't live in Georgia anymore, but where I'm from, people have, if they're close to Tennessee, they'll have a Tennessee license as well in kind of covered area. So a lot of those I realized were, the same person with multiple licenses. And so I started digging into the data, and I'm pretty handy with SQL, SQL, depending on how you call it. And so I pulled that into my trusty Postgres database. And I also had another data source that I like to use occasionally with geodata. So it's a really robust set of zip codes and how those relate to counties and cities and states in the US. And so I was able to combine that data and basically start asking some questions of the data. And I realized pretty quickly, the first round that I did, I came up with an analysis and I put it up on LinkedIn and a couple places on social. And someone said, "Hey, in your top 10 list, Texas is missing." And I thought, "Oh, how did I miss Texas?" And so I realized, okay, well, what's going on here? Then I look back into the data. And so what I realized, and a few people reached out to me from different like federal agencies and things like that, said, "Hey, and gave me some tips and stuff." And what I realized is the ASC appraisal subcommittee data, it's sourced from all the individual states. And so the data is highly inconsistent. All the fields aren't, filled out. There's no unique identifier, meaning like an ID that identifies the same person that might be in multiple states. And what I understand, the federal government tried to do that internally, but it's like herding cats, dealing with all these state agencies, and they did the best they could. I know it's kind of a political thing now with the federal government and all these departments and cutbacks and stuff, but a lot of times it's kind of that hate the game, don't hate the player kind of situation. Like these guys were doing the best they could with the data, but they're kind of restricted. So the data is just really dirty. And so, for example, the Texas data, each license, the data has their home address and then has a license for a state, which might be a different state. Well, Texas was missing the home address. So I kind of had to backfill it, but it's not 100% consistent because they might have licenses in multiple states. And so I did a whole bunch of rounds on cleaning the data, got it, to the best point that I could. Oh, and the other big issue were names. So you have a lot of people with the same names, with the exact same names. And I'm no longer a licensed appraiser, but I remember at one point there was another person named Chase Persley, which is a name didn't think would be very common, period. But he happened to be an appraiser. So you have situations like that where if you try to take a look, okay, where's everyone named, Jim Humphreys in the US? There might be other ones, and if you count that as one person, you're making a mistake. So I had to do a couple little tricks there with the data to kind of like do a scoring system based on their addresses. It was a little complex. So the final results I think are pretty good shape, but it's not going to be 100% accurate. It's probably, I don't know, minus 5 plus 5% accuracy range. Did the best I could, but I thought the numbers were pretty interesting. Unfortunately, they only had just current data. I'd really love to have historical data so you can actually see the trends, if it's going up, if it's going down, and that sort of thing.
That is absolutely crazy interesting. And just we have an SQL guy in the office that works on another business in the office with us. And he talks a lot about data hygiene, cleaning the data up, deduping files, making sure you're not recognizing the same thing over and over again. It seems like you spent a good bit of time on data hygiene in this project.
Yeah, and I have a background in tech, and that's kind of a broad thing, programming and working with databases and stuff. And then you have kind of like the data analysis as sort of it can be a separate profession. So I wouldn't say that I'm, a top expert at that. So I kind of like cavemaned my way through it and finding ways to clean up the data. So, there's still a lot of mistakes in the data. I open sourced all the queries and stuff. So if you are a programmer, you know how to work with that sort of technology, feel free. I link to it in the article so you can pull it down. And if you have any suggestions on how I can improve it, if you see any weird anomalies, do let me know. I'd like to get this in pretty good shape so that way every year the new data comes out, I can just run it through the system and then get the cleaned up data. But ultimately, I'd like to see the appraisal subcommittee find a way, and I'd like to see the states get on board and say, okay, well, there's no reason. This is literally something they could solve in a week if they got everybody on the same page. It's not a huge technical hurdle. They just need to decide on a method for generating a unique ID that identifies a person. Maybe that's Social Security, some version of a Social Security without the whole thing being exposed. I don't know what that is, but this is something that could be solved and should be solved. So maybe they need a little bit of dodge cleanup there, without maybe without letting anybody go. I'm sure we need everybody there. But it's something that really needs to be fixed. We need to be able to know at any time, how many appraisers are in the U.S., and what their license information and stuff. I mean, we need that for lending purposes and everything. So
I'm curious, Chase. All right, so you started off with 91,000 plus or minus active appraisers. After going through your process, what's the real number?
So I came to 66,715. And like I said, that's probably plus five or minus five. And I had a few people reach out and said, yeah, that's about the number we have internally, that we came up with on our own. So, I can't say it's not going to be a totally accurate number just because the data is messy.
Right.
But that's a different number than 91,000. And that's a different number than I actually originally assumed there were about like 80,000, 75 to 80,000 appraisers. Of course, that number is not too far off of that, but it's a $10,000 person difference. And it still didn't really answer the question, what are the trends? What's happened over the years? And I'd really like to see all that data published historically so that we could have access to it because there's a lot of talk about people retiring out of the profession and that sort of stuff.
Yeah, yeah. Well, let me ask you this: what were some of the rabbit holes that you found that you wanted to run down while you were doing this process?
Yeah, good question. The really big rabbit holes were like the people who had like 50 licenses. The lady I worked for in my MAI that I worked for had licenses in a lot of states and would constantly get temporary licenses because we specialized. We were a specialty firm, and there were only a few companies at the time that did senior housing. So a lot of them are the trends that I noticed is they were specialty appraisers, but it was just mind blowing that there's like a top percentage that have licenses in almost all states, and that seems like a full-time job to me, just keeping those things up to date. And also what's the old forgetting what it's called off the top of my head. Licensed residential seems to be getting phased out in a lot of states, if not phased out completely. But like just to give you a quick idea, like certified residential, there's about 44,500. Certified general, 40,240, and licensed residential, 6,500. One thing that stuck out was how many certified generals there were, 40,000 compared to certified residential, 44,000. I thought that number of certified residential would be, a good bit. Well, 49% for certified residential, 44% for certified general. I thought that residential would be higher. So I guess maybe what that means is there are a lot of people with certified general who are just doing residential appraisals. At least that's my kind of guess on that. But so those were some of the rabbit holes. And then it was interesting to see, for the most part, like I also ran some ratios and did some geographical distribution counts. But basically, like I ran some numbers to see what the appraisers were per 100,000 people, and they kind of averaged around like 20 appraisers per 100,000 people. Like California is 19.1, Texas 19.2, Florida 25. But then you had some that ranged up, like Georgia 30%, Virginia 35%, which I thought was pretty high. So I don't know what those numbers necessarily mean. Maybe it means there's an oversupply, or for whatever reason people are refinancing their houses more. But one of the interesting things was just hooking this data set up to geographic data, to zip code information and city information, county information, as well as state information. And I also broke it down by region. And so that made me think there's probably all kinds of other interesting public data we could cross-reference this with. And like I said, that set's all there up on GitHub, if you know what that is, and if you know how to work with that kind of data, feel free to take a stab at it and see what interesting things you can pull out.
That's amazing that you're putting that out there so that other people can play with it and see what they find out. And I'm sure there are many people listening to this podcast today that are thinking of, well, I wonder about, and the data is there for you to be able to do that. Chase, I could sit and talk about these kinds of things all day long. I love kind of studying what the industry is doing. What are some conclusions that you felt were most relevant to the appraisal population?
Conclusions. I had a lot of really interesting private conversations. Some that aren't really ones you want to talk out in public, but along the lines of, did you see any trends about like racial trends? Of course, you can't really see that in the data, or gender and that kind of stuff. And I did think, okay, well, technically, I could run the names through an AI classifier and have it do a score. Is this name typically a female name or a male name? I didn't want to open that can of worms, but that is probably something, if you really wanted to know that, you could probably run that through an AI classification system to see if that person is likely female, likely male. Because that's been one of the topics is the ratio, and that's something I'm just not going to open that can of worms. But that's something that was interesting.
Yeah, no
But
doubt.
also a lot of private conversations. And somebody did send me a list of their own compiled year-over-year change and compared it to, they showed me the year-over-year change from the data they had. They didn't do the full analysis. They just did the total licenses and compared that year-by-year change, and then did a state-by-state. Well, they just did a list of all the states and whether it's a red state or a blue state and whether it declined or increased. I'm not going to say which way it went, but there were definitely some clear trends based on the political situation in the state and the number of licensed appraisers.
Interesting. And I think one of the things that we have to point out when you're playing with data, when you're analyzing data, I think it's important to keep in mind that you've got causal relationships and coincident relationships. And just because something happens at the same time as another thing doesn't mean that it caused that thing.
Yeah, and another thing I noticed is, the 2008, I think that's probably when we really started seeing a drop off in licensed appraisers. And I really wish I had the data from that time. But the way I noticed that was the percentage. I pulled some numbers on length of time that people have that length of time that appraisers have been licensed. And so let me see if I can find that number. It's probably in here deep. Yeah, experience levels. So I thought this number was probably wrong, and then I dug into it. And it seems right. I still think it's not right. If anybody has some insight, reach out to me. But like I found that people who held appraisers who held license for 0 to 5 years, that's 23,000, about 24,000 licenses. That's 35%. That seems really high. And then you have 20 plus years, 29%. And then you kind of have in the middle, like 5 to 10 years, 10%, 10 to 15, 11%, 15 to 20, 15%. So it actually feels like maybe there was a drop off at some point. And you had people who really, held on like a pit bull. Then you just had people like this wasn't worth it, and they left the profession. And it just kind of feels like that 2008 range. But I don't really have enough data to really get insight into that. So it's kind of a observation, but
Yeah,
not a strong opinion.
the strong number for people that have been licensed for a long period of time does not surprise me, because in general, and this is anecdotally, in general, when I talk to people who have been certified for quite some time, they spent so much time and effort gaining that certification, they just don't want to let it go. Even if they're going to step away from the business for a period of time, they will maintain that credential because it was so difficult to get. So I think that might explain that a little bit. All right, so I want to get to what I think is one of the most interesting questions. Do you, Chase Persley, think that there is any validity to the lack of appraisers in the industry or an appraiser shortage?
Yeah. What does that mean, appraiser shortage? I guess that's where we could start. Does it mean that, take it at face value, there's not enough appraisers to meet the demands of, lending needs and other needs? Is it a shortage in terms of, I don't know. I don't really have a good answer for you on that. Right now, it doesn't feel like it. And I think most appraisers would tell you that, they could appreciate a little bit more work coming in the door. And that's kind of one of the impetuses behind jobs and appraisal, to put out there that there are other avenues for working in this industry instead of turning in your license and going and work as a real estate agent or something terrible like that. Just kidding, agents. But yeah, I don't know. I don't know. What's your feel on that?
I mean, I have a notion that the first time I started hearing appraiser shortage loud and often was about 6 months into COVID. And I think there were a lot of things going on in the market, not the least
Right.
of which
Yeah,
was
yeah.
crazy low interest rates, people moving, from larger urban areas to smaller
Right, right.
places. There was just a lot of activity, and I think if we're talking about, what is normal, what is anomalous, I think that market time frame was in total an anomaly. It's not normal for us to see that much activity in that short of a time frame. So I think, if you looked at it in a snapshot of the COVID pandemic, then it would look like we don't have enough appraisers. But I think in general, realizing that markets go up and down, and the real estate market in particular goes up and down and expands and contracts, I think we do have a good base of solid long-term appraisers. I do think it would behoove us as an industry to continue to encourage younger people to come into this business.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. And that's always been a big thing with me. I graduated in 2008, in the summer, right? I guess that whatever that final semester was. And that was a tough time to find any kind of job in real estate, let alone, appraisal. And I kind of lucked out. I actually had to go work. I went and worked as a commercial landscaper for a while because there were no jobs. It was really tough. I was broke. I was student loaned to death, and I didn't think I was going to have to take student loans in the first place. And so I still had to get my appraisal license, so I did the training. So I put my courses on credit cards, which Appraisal Institute, are very expensive. These days you have like appraiser e-learning, and some other more reasonably priced, really high quality training. But back then it was tough. It's really tough. I think there's a lot of barriers to entry for the appraisal profession that are unnecessary. I've had many conversations with people about, I think that entry level training needs to be affordable, attractive, in order to get people into the industry instead of feel like some kind of blocker.
Yeah.
And that doesn't mean let everybody in and open the floodgates, but that means, make it so it's attractive, and you don't have to put it on your credit card, necessarily, to get, your basic coursework in to go sit for the exam.
Yeah.
And also, show that it's a cool industry. A lot of people kind of conflate, non-real estate people conflate appraisers with real estate agents and some other people in the industry, which is really unfortunate. But I think it's a really cool industry because of the data analysis side of things. If you're the kind of person who likes to be in the numbers, but then break it up and be able to break it up and go do a site inspection and actually look at the physical property, I think it's a really interesting industry. And if you want to go work for the county or go work for one of the big shops, there are jobs out there. But you can work for yourself and have a lot of flexibility, and it's very, very flexible, a great industry. And I know a lot of people are screaming, hair on fire, AI is going to take all our jobs and stuff. Look, I'm deep in AI all day long. It's really hooked up really great to coding tools and marketing tools and that kind of stuff. You know, I don't think it's going to take our jobs anytime soon. You still need a brain to do this type of work.
Yeah,
So
no doubt.
that could
No
almost be a whole
doubt.
nother episode, but yeah. Um,
Yeah. Yeah, one of the things that I wanted to touch on, and I know we're getting close to the end of this episode, but I do want to touch on this. The question that we had talked about before recording this is, do you think appraisers are phasing out of the business? What I'd like to is get your answer to that. Do you think appraisers are starting to phase out? And then I'd like to tell a couple of real quick stories about that.
You mean phasing out, like retiring out and that sort of thing? Yeah, the numbers seem to show that, under people with licenses under 5 years, 35%. So if those numbers are correct, that shows that new people have entered the industry in the last 5 years. In the last couple of years have been especially tough, like the last 2, 3 years have been especially tough for the appraisal industry, but people seem to still be getting licenses. I guess I could break that down on a year by year basis over the past 5 years. Maybe everybody got it that first year of COVID, and everything was great. But the numbers seem to show that people are entering, the appraisal industry.
I like that. I've heard a lot of people talking about the new UAD coming down the pike, limited production coming in September, full production coming sometime the first of next year, mandatory acceptance coming the end of that year. And I've heard a lot of people say, oh, we're going to have a mass exodus of appraisers. Here's the interesting thing, and again, this is anecdotal, which is primarily what I'm dealing with because I'm out talking to appraisers person to person in different locations. I've met with two groups of appraisers in smaller rural areas, and after going through the UAD training compiled by Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, I asked the appraisers in the classroom, plus or minus 30 appraisers in the room each time, do you think it's time to get out of the business, or are you going to stick around? And every single one of them said, I'm not ready to go. And I'm willing to tie in and learn how to do this new process. So I think that anecdotally speaks to the fact that, appraisers like me that are, how do we say this, mature in the industry, that have been around for a few minutes, are probably going to stick around by and large. And the fact that we've got, newer people coming into the business, I think we're going to be fine as an industry.
I think so. I mean, you have these hair on fire appraisers who kind of negative about some of the new stuff coming, and I guess I always kind of have this "we'll see" attitude. But think about it this way: life changes, technology changes. You either adapt to your tooling, you either learn the new process, and I don't know, maybe some of these new changes that are coming are going to be bad. Well, there's a process to deal with that. So you just you push back on it and you refine it and find a way. But if you look back into the history of technology and just working on appraisal reports, I mean, there was a time that I'm a little bit younger, but from what I hear, there was a time that people were, getting out the Elmer's glue and gluing on their Polaroid, comp photos onto their dead tree report that they typed up on a typewriter. I'm sure there were people back then hooting and hollering about, some new standardized form or whatever, this or that. So, you could have that mentality, or you could have the mentality that not just the appraisal industry, but every industry changes, processes change, the economy changes, demographics change, the economic environment change. You just have to, if you like this type of work, you just kind of have to roll with it. Of course, you have to keep the bills paid too. So you just kind of have to find that balance.
Yeah, no doubt. And you mentioned the glue stick, Elmer's glue, and putting photographs on the dead paper report or the dead tree reports. That's how I grew up. I mean, I literally remember the double-sided tape machine that's about the size of a brick and heavy as a brick, and putting double-sided tape on pictures and putting them in the report. So we have come a long
the
way.
MLS records where you had to flip through and find your comps and stuff.
Oh, good Lord, yes.
And you have some really interesting new software out here that pull some of that data automatically, and you have people complaining about it, and people and there are good arguments on both sides, but it's like, remember what it used to be like? It was very tedious.
We used to have to go to the courthouse and go through the tax assessor's records and pull, files and photocopy several pieces of paper and bring them back to the office and
pay for
analyze them there. And now that's all online.
Mm-hmm.
I think, look, technology changes. We have to, as professionals, figure out, as you said, that balance of I'm going to work with the new technology, work with the tools that are coming in, and maintain relevance. Chase, I can't thank you enough for being here. Let me do this. I want to take a real quick break, and we're going to hear from one of our sponsors, and we will be right back.
ACI introduces ACI Sky Workbench, a cutting-edge cloud-based platform designed to streamline UR/AR appraisal report generation like never before. With seamless workflow integration, automated data management, and built-in compliance, Workbench empowers appraisers to work smarter, faster, and with greater accuracy. Visit aciweb.com for more info.
Welcome back, everybody. You're listening to the Appraisal Buzzcast. I'm Hal Humphreys, your host. I've got Chase Pursley on the line with me today. We've had an incredible conversation about some deep dive data analysis Chase has done with data straight from the Appraisal Subcommittee, talking about numbers of appraisers, various bits of information we can tease out of ASC data. Chase, thank you for taking the time to be here today. Now, I'm going to warn you, Jim Morrison is real fond of throwing an anonymous appraiser a question in my direction and my guest's direction. And I think he does it just for the sole purpose of tripping us up. Jim Morrison, do you have an anonymous appraiser question that Chase and I could try to answer?
We do have an anonymous appraiser question. If anybody has any questions for us, reach out at comments@appraisalbuzz.com and we'll make sure to use it for a future guest. But before I ask the question, I'm going to start with a shameless plug for Valuation Expo. Any of those appraisers that Chase talked about that are registered in over 40 states, have 40 to 50 licenses, you need to come to Valuation Expo, get all 50 taken care of at once. August 11th through 13th in Las Vegas. We submit for CE approval in all 50 states, so you'll be covered with just one class. So we got you covered for that. Let me jump into the anonymous appraiser question. It says, I recently did an appraisal where I took a bunch of site inspection photos with my phone. When I got home, they seemed to have disappeared. How do I recover them? Do I bite the bullet, call the homeowner back and reinspect, or what do I do?
Ouch. It depends on the phone. Most people have either an Android, some type of an Android phone or an iPhone. And it depends on where you took the photos. So if you took the photos with your phone app, what I would do is first look around for first look into the Photos app, which I assume they probably have. Secondly, I would look on your iPhone into your Files app. You can pull down pull the screen down and do a search for files and just dig through the files. And I believe there's also a Photos folder. So I would look through there. I think it's probably, and that's on an iPhone. I think it's a similar process on an Android. I think it's probably highly unlikely that you would take a bunch of photos and them actually not get saved to your device. And if the device did have issues, you would probably know why you were taking the photos, like maybe your memory is full. So my guess is the photos are probably there somewhere. And this is actually a great question for some of the AI systems. You can say, I have, XYZ model phone. I seem to have lost my photos. What are the steps that I can take to relocate these photos? Secondly, if you have some kind of online file sync, and like I said, this is assuming you used your phone app, the built-in photo app into your phone. Secondly, I would, if you have one of these online file sync systems, check that, obviously. If you don't, I highly recommend those. This is something I've been using for over a decade. So what I'm talking about are like your Box.coms, your Dropbox. Google has a file sync service. Basically, there's a whole bunch of really cheap services that you just hook up to your devices, hook it up to your computer, and they'll keep all your files in sync. So this way you should have physical copies. This way you would have physical copy of the file on your phone, and then it would get synced to the cloud, and then it would also get synced to your computer. So you won't end up in a situation. I don't think I've lost a file in over a decade, and it's not because I'm some kind of tech genius. It's mostly that this is largely a solved problem with the online file backup services. That said, things can always break with those. There could always be issues. I still recommend, like on a quarterly basis, whatever time period you think makes sense for yourself. If you really want to feel comfortable and comply with USPAP and keep all your work, and not just photos, but all your work files, buy one of those, several terabyte external hard drives and plug it in and back things up to that. And maybe keep it in a fireproof safe or keep it off-site. So a couple years ago, but I saw an appraiser like lost their house in some natural disaster. Maybe it was Florida or something like that. They're like, "Oh, I've lost all my files, my entire last decade of work files." That shouldn't happen. You should be able to go to Best Buy, buy a new computer, log into your Dropbox, have a coffee, uh, wait a couple hours. All your photos will get backed up, all your files will get backed up. There's no reason in 2025 you should lose a file, especially considering how cheap and easy it is to set up. You don't have to be a genius to set these systems up. I don't know if that'll help you recover files that you may have lost, but that can help prevent file loss in the future.
Yeah, and I will say, as an older appraiser who is a bit of a Luddite, number one, the likelihood of the ones and zeros just disappearing is pretty slim. There's a good chance you will find the photos if you look long and hard enough. The question I would have as again, as an older appraiser is, am I going to spend more time looking for the JPEGs than I am just going out and retaking the photos? That's a hard question to answer, but sometimes just go out and retake the photos, fine. But take the opportunity to have a backup system automated, because there's no reason to be worried about losing photographs like that. I've only ever lost one file associated with my phone and work. And I literally, it was an interview that I did with a witness, and my phone literally died shortly after the interview. And it had not synced with the service that I used for the recordings, and it was gone. That's the only time I've ever lost a single file using the phone. So I would say, I second what Chase said. Even if you go into ChatGPT and say, I have an iPhone 16 Pro, I seem to have lost some photos I just took this afternoon, help me find them. That's not a bad place to start.
Yeah, and you made a good point. Make sure your devices are charged before you go to your site inspections.
Yeah, no doubt. Okay, Chase, thank you. Jim Morrison, do we have anything else?
No, we're going to include the link to Chase's article. I really thought it was great. Chase, thanks so much for joining us today.
Yeah, it was a lot of fun. I'm glad to talk about data and nerdy stuff anytime.
I love it. Chase, thank you again for being here. And if we have nothing else, for Chase Persley and Jim Morrison, I'm Hal Humphreys, and that is your Appraisal Buzzcast for this week.